Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll get started. Garasfan's kingdom has been brought to life by a girl who has mastered some pretty powerful magic. She played a rather large role in the 20-year war with the kingdom of Voltar, and in the end, the girl became the Duchess of the kingdom of Garasfan. However, everything was not as smooth as one might think. 3 months after the end of the war, in November, she, the girl hailed as a heroine, was about to be executed in the enemy kingdom. People shouted and called her a demon and talked about how many people died because of her. One of the girls cried the whole time and said she wished her husband was alive instead of her. Even the children threw stones at her, saying she was a demon and asking for the return of their fathers, whom the girl had ruthlessly taken away. They were all cheerfully talking about burning the heroine Garasfan with her own hellfire as soon as possible. They were sending her straight to the devil because she must have had connections there, and they were waiting for her for a long time. At that moment, a man approached the girl. He addressed the crowd and said that Celia Felix, the heroine of Garasfan and the greatest sinner of Voltar, would be executed any minute now. The people, when they heard this, immediately rejoiced. They began to clamor for it to happen soon. The man who was to execute her said that because of the infernal magic the girl possessed, more than 1,000 people had died. People kept calling her a demon and a horrible person, and kept wishing her the hardest and most hellish death. The girl answered nothing to this, but only stood and wept silently. She didn't understand what everyone there was accusing her of. After all, she was just a knight who was defending her country. And she fought for the freedom of Mr. Claude, with whom she was in love. And Celia was greatly distressed when one day he summoned her to him, calling her a loyal servant, and afterward inquiring with disgust how she could have cooperated with Voltar. He had some papers on his desk, by means of which he had just found out about it. The man was just furious, and did not understand how she could hide it all so well. When the girl heard this information, it was a great surprise to her. She did not understand what the man was even talking about, for she had no thoughts of cooperating with them. She came close to him and said that she was after all his loyal knight and would never betray her lord. But the man wouldn't listen. He said that her excuses were useless, because the next day he was going to hand her over to the kingdom of Voltar. When Celia heard this, she was incredibly surprised. She couldn't believe that he was really willing to do that to her. The girl was always loyal to Mr. Claude and asked that he believe her, but the man would not even listen to her. Then another approached the girl from behind. She addressed her as a sister and said that the evidence was in her face. This unknown girl was Juliet, and she said that she could not understand why Celia did not confess, for she should simply say that she had reported really to Voltar, and then everything would be much easier. But the girl, getting even more angry, began to shout at her sister, telling her not to talk about such careless things, for it was all nonsense. Juliet didn't understand how she could behave like this, and called her the ultimate traitor. But suddenly a man named Kai intervened in the conversation. He addressed His Highness. Guy said that Felix's influence was much stronger than that of anyone else, and also added that the man ought to know it, so he should think it over again, so as not to jump to conclusions. When Celia heard Kai's defense, she was very surprised. She couldn't believe that he actually wanted to stand up for her. However, the gentleman was not going to change his mind, and said that it was absolutely unnecessary to do so, for her sin was quite obvious. The guy already wanted to protest and keep proving his point, but the gentleman calmed him down by telling him that if he didn't stop doing that, he would consider him for the charges. Then suddenly Juliet ran closer to her sister and, smiling wickedly, made a very sad voice. She said it was all incredibly awful, however she in turn felt incredibly good. Celia, upon hearing this, was incredibly angry. She couldn't believe that the girl was really doing this to her. But at that moment the guards came running into the room and said that by order of His Highness, he was arresting her. Celia had no time even to do anything, for they had seized her by the arms. She appealed to Mr. Claude, but it was useless. She was still screaming, but then suddenly a man interrupted her voice and told the guards to just pick her up and take her away. And the moment she was on her deathbed, she kept thinking about this Mr. Claude, who just believed that information. Suddenly, the man who was to execute her came up to her and asked her how she felt about being sentenced to death in an enemy country. He even called her the great goddess of war. But the man, suddenly looking behind her back, where her hands were chained, noticed something interesting. The girl had a pretty ring on one of her fingers. It was gold, and it had a small diamond. The man immediately began to take it off, with a smile on his face, saying that even a goddess of war remains a girl and wears various jewelry. Celia was outraged that he was doing this, for it was the last memory of her mother. So in a trembling voice, she asked that he stop. But the man, continuing to remove her jewelry, said she wouldn't need it anymore. So he didn't think it was appropriate to leave it here. Once the ring was in his hands, he took a closer look at it, and then with a heavy sigh, tossed it aside, saying that it was just a cheap ring. The ring ended up falling right next to the firewood to which the girl was chained. After that, the man commanded the other knights and told them to set fire already, for he didn't think it was necessary to linger any longer. And immediately after this deed, the girl began to burn intensely. She felt the heat and cried out in pain, and heard the cries of the people around her wishing her death and rejoicing that she was dying in agony. Celia was very hot and she couldn't breathe. She just gasped and thought about the fact that she was going to have to die, apparently, just like that. She was about to give up and close her eyes when she heard a voice nearby. She immediately turned to see who it was. And as soon as Celia saw the silhouette of a man, she immediately recognized it was Kai. He looked incredibly angry and agitated. She looked at him for the last few minutes of her life and thought about how this man was the only one left on her side. She gave him one last smile and thought that if she had listened to his words much earlier, surely none of this would have happened. Soon after, the fever became much more intense, and the girl couldn't just stand there with her eyes open, so she immediately closed them. Some time had passed since then, and the next time she opened her eyes, she noticed that she was lying on the bed. Celia was all in tears and didn't understand what was even going on, as well as where she was. For a while, she just lay there staring at the ceiling, and after that, looking around, she realized it was her room. However, she didn't understand how this could happen, for she clearly remembered being burned alive at the stake, so Celia even assumed for a while that it was just a dream. However, she remembered very well the sensation of having flames engulfing her skin, so she was unequivocally certain that she had been burned. She was betrayed by her country and Mr. Claude, and then executed in an enemy country. Celia has lived her whole life for the kingdom of Garasfon and its people. But in the end, they have only betrayed her, sending her to an imminent death. Then she stood up and walked over to the mirror to see if she was all right. And as soon as she saw her reflection in it, she was very surprised. Somehow the girl was incredibly young. She immediately started touching her face and tried to figure out how this could have even happened. Celia then examined her hands and noticed that they had been scarred before. But at that moment, they were perfectly clean and smooth. She immediately thought of her memories of her mother and didn't understand how this was even possible. But then the maid came into the room and told her that she was finally awake. And afterward, in a whisper, the maid said to herself that she had better sleep longer, for that would be less work for her. Celia paid no attention to it, but only inquired what year, day, and month it was at that time. The maid, hearing this, was very much surprised and asked why she was suddenly interested. But the girl had no intention of explaining herself to her, and only said that she had asked her a question which she must answer. The maid became a little uncomfortable with this, but she still started to nag and wondered if the girl had forgotten when her birthday was. But after that, she did name the year, the month, and the date. Celia knew immediately that she was only turning 17 on that day. Somehow she managed to travel back in time 7 years after her death. There are actually 2 kingdoms on the continent of Makaria, Garasfon and Voltar. And 20 years ago, a war broke out between these kingdoms over Garasfon's heritage. It was a rather protracted war. A lot of land was completely wiped off the face of the earth, and a lot of people were dead. And when both countries were in despair, a light descended upon the kingdom of Garasfon, namely Celia Felix, a knight of this kingdom and the daughter of an earl family. Despite being the bastard child of the Tolos family, she still had quite a talent for magic, and with the help of her magic, namely Fire Thunder, she led her homeland to victory. This is how she got her nickname Goddess of War. She was able to protect her people from even greater loss of life and destruction. In truth, Celia had been incredibly hurt when she had been betrayed and killed. However, she did not understand why she had traveled back in time exactly 7 years. Before she was reborn, The girl remembered being approached by Mr. Claude one night at the military camp. He said that the victory was pretty close, and thanks to the girl they were able to get this far. Smiling, he said that he was really truly grateful to her for such incredible help and support, because without her, they wouldn't have been able to make such progress. Celia was immediately embarrassed and replied that it wasn't all like that. Their army had put in a pretty great effort, so she didn't think it was necessary to belittle their successes. But the man still insisted. He took her hands in his and said she had had a very hard time. The girl replied that she was very glad to be useful to her beloved country. They looked at each other in silence for a while, and then Claude came up to her and embraced her. Celia was very surprised at this behavior and asked what was going on, and he, continuing to hug her, replied that the success of this operation depended on her work, and wondered if she could fulfill his request with her greatest magic. At first the girl was very surprised, but then she hugged him back and said she would gladly fulfill any of his requests. Claude smiled wickedly then and thanked her for it, but the request was actually quite horrible. Soon afterwards she went out into the forest and saw Kai standing behind a tree. She immediately went up to him and asked him what he was doing outdoors at such a late hour. As soon as she called him by name, he immediately looked at her and told her to call him Excellency Eagle Cole. Celia was surprised at this behavior. She came closer to him and wondered what had happened and why he looked so serious. The man immediately inquired why she had suddenly agreed to the reckless strategy she had been offered. The girl looked at him warily and asked why he thought that. As a knight, she must follow her lord's orders, so she would simply have no choice. But Kai said it was just really stupid. Only you learned how to blindly follow other people's orders without thinking them through. The girl wouldn't listen to the accusations against her, so she just turned around and was about to leave. But the man stopped her and said she was a lot like those girls who swirl around him trying to get more attention. Kai sighed heavily and added that she was so badly blinded by this love that she couldn't even see anything around her. The girl, indignant, asked that he not say such nonsense. She was incredibly angry that he could even suggest such a thing, when the man reached forward and asked her to calm down, because His Highness was just using her. She needed to think with her own head, not blindly follow his orders. Kai explained that he considered her the most ordinary pawn in his big game. And Celia, hearing this, became even more angry and said that it was all a lie. Mr. Claude really loves her and would never have done this to her if he had known it was dangerous. The man, sighing heavily, asked again for her to calm down a bit. After all, if a person really loved someone, he would definitely not send his loved one straight to death. Celia was so indignant at him that she didn't even realize he was telling the truth. She mentally thanked him for his advice, but she realized that he didn't know their situation, so he couldn't judge. So she just turned around and asked him to leave her alone because it was completely none of his business. Kai wanted to say something else to her, for he realized that he had gone a little overboard with his tone. Because of that, she was probably offended. But the girl addressed him respectfully and said that she was happy with this strategy, and as a knight, would use her magic to accomplish such a mission. She also added that it was absolutely not about her feelings, but about her commitment to the country and Mr. Claude. Kai was incredibly angry that she didn't want to listen to him at all, but said he understood now. The girl apologized to him once more, and after that she headed back to the military camp. And at that moment, when she had already been reborn, she knew perfectly well that she had been a complete idiot for trusting Claude in such matters, and had not listened to Kai at all. For in the end he was indeed right. Because of her love for Mr. Claude, she had overlooked one very important thing. The girl did not know for what reason she had returned to the past at all, or in what way. However, she believed that now was her chance to start her life with a clean slate. Celia was not going to repeat the same mistakes she had made in her previous life and wanted to be the mistress of her own life. She was very serious and was going to be truly happy, at least in this life, and that no one would dare to betray her again. Celia thought about the fact that if she was turning 17 on this day, she was only 1 year away from becoming Mr. Claude's knight. She has more than enough time to start over. However, she can't change anything if she stays in her parents' home. So the girl realized that she needed someone who could become her guardian, and Celia already knew very well who that person could be. She began to stare at the maid. When she noticed this, she wondered if she could stop staring at her so intently, for it made her uncomfortable. But the girl apologized and asked what her name was. The maid immediately gave her name. Her name was Marie. Then she inquired if her assumption that the girl was her maid was correct. Marie said nothing to that, only sighed heavily and turned away from her. When Celia replied that she might think poorly of her because she was a child out of wedlock, but from now on, she asked that she show her respect. As soon as the maid heard this, she was so surprised that she even sputtered a few drops of the water she was holding. Celia replied that she would like to eat now, so she asked her if she could bring her some food. Marie said with a heavy sigh that if she realized that she was only a dirty child, then why did she suddenly dare to order her around? The girl then replied that since she wanted to talk like that, they would, and explained that despite being an illegitimate child, she was still Count Tolos's daughter. Of course, Marie was angry when she heard this, for she was indeed right, and Celia also added that this was why she couldn't ignore her requests, and she also wondered if her maid could have her butler Flock call Flock to her. When the maid heard this, she became even more angry, but she did not answer her mistress, for she thought it would make a greater scandal. Soon afterward, the butler did enter her room and bowed and said hello to the girl. Celia immediately apologized to him for calling him out so suddenly, but the man replied that it was fine, so she didn't have to worry about it. Then she came close to the butler and handed him the envelope and said that she wanted him to deliver the letter as soon as possible. The man saw this and was very surprised, but the girl also told him to be sure to wait for an answer and to keep it secret. Father Flock, bowing, replied that he understood and would send it to someone who could be trusted with such an important matter. The girl, smiling, immediately thanked him for it. The girl smiled and thanked him immediately, but it was not enough for him to thank her. He was studying some book and thought about the fact that magic had begun to distort. It made him very wary. In fact, the northern lands of the Garrisfon Kingdom belonged precisely to Cole County. Earl Cole was Kai Vernon, and he, turning to the butler, said that the magic was distorted. Then the man, bowing, begged his pardon, but said he had a letter coming. So he asked Kai how he was feeling. He said he was fine, and asked if something had happened. He then placed an envelope on his desk, saying that the letter had come from Count Tolos's estate. They wanted him to answer it as soon as possible. When Kai heard this, he was very surprised and wondered if it was because of the War Council. But the butler replied that not at all. It was the girl who sent the letter, and he thought it was something of a personal nature. Kai was a little surprised at this, but he said he understood, and immediately began to look to see who the letter was from. It said that it was from Count Tolos's daughter. As far as he could remember, she was an illegitimate daughter. So he immediately opened the letter to read what it might say. And as soon as Kai read the letter, he began to smile. The butler, who was pouring his tea at that moment, looked at the master and saw that gleaming smile. The man was very surprised at such a thing, for he had never yet seen a guy smile like that, and assumed at once that he was in love with this girl. Kai, seeing that the butler had even started spilling tea, said that he was totally thinking about the wrong thing and not even keeping track of the work he was doing. The man immediately apologized to him and said he was sorry, and the guy explained in turn that it was just a request for a visit. The butler then inquired if she really wished to stay at their estate. Kai explained that she possessed fire thunder and wished to hone her skills. The servant was silent for a while, and after that, he told the lord that it was rather strange to have a girl from another family practicing in their palace. But Kai, thinking about it, replied that it was very like her, so he wasn't surprised at all. When the butler heard this, he was very surprised and asked if he knew the girl. The gentleman did not wish to reply to this, but only asked him to prepare paper and pen for him. The butler didn't insist on his question, so he said that he would also pour him some more tea. Soon afterward, the storm cleared outside. As soon as he looked into his mug, he saw the reflection of the girl in it, and immediately thought that it was definitely her. And so a whole 10 days had passed since that moment. Celia immediately woke up and went about her estate on business. The butler, who was working just outside, immediately said that a miss was coming, so he asked that the maid say hello to her. Maria asked indignantly why they were all treating the girl with such respect. Another maid replied that it was the right thing to do, and that's why they did it. And the young butler, hearing this, went to her at once and said that she must not yet be aware of it, for Miss Celia had changed a great deal in the last few days. He explained that she scolded them a lot, and even punished them when they behaved inappropriately and were lazy. As soon as the maid heard this, she was immediately indignant, and didn't understand how she dared to do such a thing, for she had been afraid of even them all the time before. She just couldn't believe that it was really true. But then suddenly, another maid replied that she had already arrived, so they should bow their heads to her. All of the house staff immediately stood in a line and bowed as Celia began to walk past them. Since the girl decided to start her life with a clean slate, she thought she shouldn't hold herself back any longer. She simply told the servants to do their work properly, and when she looked at them this time, she realized that people change if you change your attitude toward them. In fact, before she had been reborn, she had been very afraid to do such things. She could never stand up for herself or her honor. The girl remembered very well how, when she was still very young, she had visited the market for the first time, but everyone around called her the daughter of a maid and did not understand what she had forgotten at such an event. One day her stepmother even came up to her and irritably asked her why she had come at all, because she was only dishonoring their family. Celia apologized and said she had come just to watch, because the banquet was incredibly lavish, but her stepmother said that important guests were at the event, so she had to leave. Juliet, who was standing next to her mother, lifted her head up and said that it was just like that. If her half-sister, who looked dirty, was present with them, the guests would have a very bad opinion of them. She also said that the girl was incredibly smelly and that her dress was very stained, so she absolutely should not have come to the event. Juliet added that she would be very embarrassed if someone found out that they were from the same family. Celia couldn't stand it then and began to cry, because she was very hurt by such words. She was just a child. She always wanted to be friends with her half-sister, since they were about the same age, but Juliet always hurt her. As a child, Celia didn't understand why they disliked her, since she had done absolutely nothing wrong to them. It is true that Fathol's father had forgotten the affair with her mother, but that does not mean that the child born of their intimacy should be abused and humiliated. Celia was able to inherit the blood and magic of the Tolos family, and now she won't let anyone hurt her because she also deserves respect. At this very time, breakfast was taking place on the estate. The whole family gathered around one table. Celia's father's new wife said they've been having quite a few problems lately. When the man heard this, he was very surprised and asked her what she was talking about. She replied that she was referring to his daughter. The woman said that her behavior had changed a lot lately because that's what absolutely all servants say. His son agreed and added that she frequents the training ground and participates in training together. When the man heard this, he was very surprised and asked if she was really practicing. Charlotte spoke then, saying that she thought the girl was only doing it to spite the knight. Her brother agreed, adding that it was true, and that it was only to be expected of a commoner's daughter. But then suddenly an elderly woman who was their grandmother spoke up and told them not to be so foolish. She explained that it is very rare to find such talented and beautiful girls. As soon as the woman heard that, she replied to her mother that she shouldn't say that. Celia might look good, but her hair and eye color did not belong to the Felix family. She added indignantly that although the woman had cared for her since she was a little girl and had grown attached to her, Celia was really just a plain silly girl. The father turned to his wife and asked that Rosa stop talking about it, for it spoils the flavor of the food. As soon as she heard this, she was very surprised. He advised her not to take his mother's words seriously. Because of her age, she might say a lot of unnecessary things. At this point, their sweet conversation was interrupted by Celia, who came in and turned to her father asking if he was really disappointed in her grandmother. She also called everyone very rude. As soon as the father saw his illegitimate daughter, he became even more serious and asked why she had come. The girl replied that there was only one reason to come to breakfast. She was a family member, so she decided to join the meal, and wondered if they thought that was such a bad thing. When Juliet and her brother heard this, they looked at her in surprise, and so did her parents. They couldn't believe that she had actually said that. But Celia, without answering their questions, simply walked over to the table and took the empty seat across from her grandmother. As soon as she did, Juliet couldn't stand it and started yelling loudly at her, telling her not to be sure her trick would work. She said that Celia was still an illegitimate child and could not be a member of their family. Then the father turned to Juliet and said that he was sure Celia had come to this place for a purpose, so he asked her to tell him exactly what that purpose was. The girl smiled and told her father that he had probably forgotten that she was 17 years old. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she wanted to say. She said it meant that she was now an adult. In other words, the reason she came to breakfast is that she now decides where she wants to live. When her father heard this, angry, he wondered if she really suddenly wanted freedom. But she had better not forget that women had no such right. Celia was well aware that he would likely argue it that way, so she was already prepared. She activated her fiery thunder abilities and wondered if she would ask for it that way. As soon as Rose saw it, she was horrified and asked if it was really that fiery thunder. Celia's half-brother and sister were simply horrified, not expecting that she had achieved such success and dared to threaten them with her power. But the girl smiled and said that it might not be possible for an ordinary girl, but a fire thunder wielder would surely have that right. Father was absolutely horrified. He could not believe that she really possessed the magic of the Tallis family, for she had never shown such ability before. It was hard for him to realize that it was Celia who had inherited the magic, and not his other children from his second wife. Then the girl's brother started yelling loudly, asking why she could use this power. He didn't understand how she could do it. Celia started to mock him, and wondered if he was a complete idiot. But the boy was incredibly angry, not understanding why the power had gone to her, and not to him. Everyone at the table was desperate except her grandmother. She smiled and said that her strength was direct proof that she came from the Earl Tallis family. The girl herself, smiling, said that even though she was an illegitimate daughter, she had more right to sit at this table than all the others combined. So the girl began to eat her breakfast in peace, enjoying a nice meal, and the fact that her entire family was incredibly angry. But then suddenly the butler came to her and told her that a letter had come for her. Celia immediately took it and thanked him, and when her father heard this, he asked who the letter was from. However, she didn't answer anything and only smiled. Then she opened the envelope to read the letter, and Juliet, sitting opposite her, could not understand in any way with whom she could communicate, since her origin was so low. The girl even assumed that it was some kind of a joke, and she was impossibly curious about who this person was. But Celia, as she began to read the letter, even smiled. It said that the Earl of Cole would indeed allow her to stay on his estate. When she read this, she immediately put the letter to her chest, hugging it, and thought to herself that this was just great news. In fact, they used to be co-workers, however, now they are just not acquaintances. That's why the girl was absolutely sure he would turn her down, but was pleasantly surprised when she read the opposite. Juliet sighed heavily, and wondered if this letter was really that important to her, as she watched her sister's reaction carefully. When Celia heard this, she looked at Juliet in surprise, not knowing what she meant. Then with a sly smile, she said that since the girl was visiting the training room, it was probably a letter from some knight. Rose indignantly said that there was nothing surprising about it, for her mother was a common commoner. Plus, she's wasting their time at the family breakfast. That was incredibly selfish of her, and Celia didn't react to their words in any way. She breathed in and out to calm herself and thought about the fact that they could say anything. She didn't care. She was silent for a while, then turned to her father and said that as the wielder of Fire Thunder, she wanted to use her power for the good of the Tallis family. That's why in order to gain more powerful strength, she will travel to Cole County for further training. After that, the girl pointed to a piece of paper saying that this letter contained permission from His Highness. When my father heard this, he was very surprised, but he said nothing. Grandmother spoke up and asked, "Isn't this in the north? Is she really going to go that far?" Celia replied to her grandmother that this was all perfectly true, but she couldn't believe she was leaving so early. Suddenly her father jumped up and started yelling, calling her Giselle. Celia was very surprised and said it was not her name, and he was mistaken. He turned to her then and asked if this was her gratitude, to just walk away, after all they had raised her all these years and even given her a home. The girl thought that if he was saying it seriously, it was just ridiculous. So, with a simple smile, she replied that it wasn't at all. Celia explained that she has her family's power and wants to learn how to control it for the sake of the family itself. Earl Cole has the most powerful magic, and he is the only one who has successfully completed the succession ceremony. This is quite different from her family. which has continued to fail at the inheritance ceremony for 3 generations. When her father heard this, he was incredibly angry. He knew very well that her magic would be very useful to their family, but he didn't want to let her go. If he gives up her head, their influence will become even stronger. He can't let Earl Cole become even more powerful, so Sev is in favor of his position. He says he can't allow her to do that. Celia didn't want to listen to anything. She replied to her father that she had already made up her mind and was no longer following his instructions. He, unable to bear it, went straight to her and, taking her hand, replied that he knew perfectly well how she felt. However, as her father, he was very worried about her. The man looked completely different. He was more caring and excited and asked if she even understood him. When Celia looked at him, she was even disgusted by the whole thing. So she just pulled her hand out and stood up from the table and said she was going to go write her reports. She also goes back to her room and does not want to hear anything more from them. Her father started shouting even more and said that he forbade her to do so. But the girl did not listen to him. When night came, Celia went to bed quite early. At that moment, her father introduced guards to her room so that she would not run away. As soon as she woke up, she immediately saw the sleeping maids near her bed. The girl had never thought he would follow her around like that, and it seemed like he was happy to just get rid of her, and that was it. Celia wanted to leave in peace. However, she unfortunately had nothing else to do. She quickly gathered all her belongings and managed to jump out the window while all the maids were asleep. As soon as the girl changed her clothes and was outside, she immediately went to the stables in order to get 1 horse and leave. She got on her horse and went on her way, mentally saying goodbye to her family. She thought that this time she would live only for herself. The guards who were near the forest immediately saw her running away, and one of them said that it was as expected. Their task was to bring her back home alive. So they all got on their horses at once and ran after her. The man told them to catch her at any cost. Celia realized that she needed to get out of Tolos County territory as quickly as possible. But suddenly the horse hit a rock and the girl almost fell. It was a miracle that she managed to grab the ropes and stay on the horse. She felt incredibly tired and couldn't believe that this was really her limit. She realized that she was too weak, and that didn't make her very happy. Celia looked back and saw that many of the guards were riding right behind her. She had no physical training at that age, so even the simplest movements were difficult for her. Soon she was able to gallop off straight into the forest, where she broke away from the guards a bit. Because Celia was very tired, she immediately made a halt and got off her horse. She sat on the floor for a while and tried to get her breathing back to normal. She knew not to forget that she was only a year old, and at that age she was just pathetic. At this rate, it would be incredibly hard for her to escape, for when she looked out from behind the tree, she saw the guards passing quite close in search of her. However, Celia still wasn't going to give up. She wanted to go all the way, even if it was going to be very hard. So as soon as the guards began to come close to her, she came out herself and said she was there. All the men were very surprised at this, for they thought she would have to be lured out. But the girl was only so brave because she had a sword behind her back. One of the guards came closer and asked if she could return with them quietly. He said with absolute certainty that he didn't want to hurt her, nor what kind of trouble to get into. Celia listened to him attentively for a while, and then she wondered if they really expected her unconditional obedience. But it was simply impossible. The guard looked at the others and gave them a look that told them to be on alert. All of them immediately drew their weapons and began to approach the girl. She realized that she couldn't use her magic in the forest, because everything would burn to the ground. And in the nearest battle, the one who makes the first move wins. She started to get closer to them and said that she just had no other choice. So she took out her blade and attacked those guards. After a while, she was able to put them all down and apologized, saying that she had absolutely no desire to return to that horrible place, so she wouldn't listen to them under any circumstances. One of the guards began to watch her movements carefully as she fell to the ground and was surprised. He didn't understand why a girl who wasn't used to fighting could fight on par with experienced knights. But he quickly brushed all that worry aside and decided that she was just a girl, so it shouldn't be a problem. He managed to make Celia fall, and rising to his feet, he raised his sword upwards, saying that this was the end. The girl was immediately frightened when she heard those words. She immediately turned in his direction, but something extraordinary happened. As soon as the man wanted to get even closer and attack her, some strange crystals started to appear around them. He immediately thought it was ice, but Celia, when she saw those crystals, she immediately realized that it was a power called icing, and it belonged to Kai, of course. When she looked in the distance, she saw a man riding to her aid on his horse. But it was still a mystery to her why he had arrived, and more importantly, how he knew she was in trouble. The boy got up from his horse and came closer to the girl, held out his hand to help her up, and asked if she was all right. The girl replied that she was fine, so he needn't worry. Just then, one of the guards came up behind him and turned to Kai in surprise, asking what he was even doing. The guy replied that if life was precious, he advised him not to twitch or his legs would simply be broken. The knight immediately realized that this was not a good thing, for he really couldn't even move his legs because they were frozen solid. Then he decided to help somehow with words, and asked him not to interfere with their task. He explained that it was an order from Count Tolas that they must fulfill. Kai turned to him and said that Celia was a guest of his estate, and she was under Earl Kula's protection. So he didn't care whose orders it was. He wouldn't allow his guest to be treated like this. No matter where she was, he wouldn't let her be treated like that. When Celia heard that, she looked at him in surprise, and couldn't believe that he was really protecting her like that, even though they didn't know each other very well. When the guard was about to object to something, Kai said that it was only a warning, so he should pass it on to his master. Kai deactivated his magic and, throwing the girl onto his horse, rode off with her towards the kingdom. They rode in silence for a while, and then Celia thanked him for saving her, but still wondered what he was doing in the middle of the woods so deep in the night. He explained that he had come to get her. She still didn't understand how he knew she might be in trouble. So Kai said she asked him for help and he couldn't refuse her. She is very gifted and he had to help her. He then turned to her and smiled and said he was really glad he had gotten there in time. Celia, when she saw the smile on his face, was very surprised. She said that she understood everything, and that she was really grateful to him from the bottom of her heart and wouldn't even know what she would have done if he hadn't come. But she also said it was a 5-day horseback ride from Cole's territory, so she wondered how he could be there so quickly. They began to drive past the ruins of the stones, and Koi explained that he had used the gate. The girl didn't immediately understand what he was talking about, so she asked again. He then looked at her in surprise and asked if she, as a Fire Thunder wielder, didn't know such simple things. Celia felt a little embarrassed about it, but she said she was ashamed to admit it, but she really had never heard of such a thing. Then the man replied that the gate could be used by those who had successfully gone through the inheritance ceremony. In fact, this very inheritance ceremony was a ritual that was performed by the head of one of the 4 counties who inherited the magical power. If a person does not have strong magical power, he will not be able to successfully complete this ritual. Tallis County has been failing since the days of the girl's great-grandfather. There are some things she hasn't been told for the same reason. Kai then tried to comfort her and told her that there was absolutely nothing wrong if she really didn't know about it, so now she would be able to see everything with her own eyes. Sigh, the girl looked at him in surprise and couldn't believe that he was trying to cheer her up. She wondered if he had always been like this. When she first started to know him, he was different from the person she was talking to now. Soon they drove up to the ruins, and the man got down from his seat. He took a knife and, cutting a little from his finger, dribbled blood on one of the stones. And right after that, a huge blue portal began to appear that they could walk through. Kai turned to Celia, who had already gotten off her horse, and said that the gate was activated, so they should head out already. The girl was determined, so she didn't even consider anything, but followed him into this mysterious gate. It was on the other side that the servants as well as the butler who served Kai were already waiting for them. The portal soon began to glow brightly, and they immediately realized that they were about to appear. So they stepped back a little so that there would be space. As soon as Kai stepped out of the portal, they bowed and greeted him, saying they were very glad he was already back. The man looked quite handsome on his horse and also greeted his servants. As soon as they exited the portal, the man got off his horse and the portal immediately closed, while Celia continued to sit on the animal. The man approached the surprised butler and said that she was his guest, so they should treat her very politely. The servant immediately cheered, as did the rest of the maids and maidservants, but Kai decided to elaborate and said in a rougher and colder voice that she was only a guest. The man immediately got upset about it and realized that he was being quite serious, so he stopped smiling so much. When Celia, who had come closer to them, thought about how even the servants just adored him. She'd never seen Kai like this before. As soon as she got off the horse, the butler came up to her and asked her to give him the reins. The girl immediately thanked him for it. She then looked at all the servants and smiled and introduced herself, so they would know how to address her. A butler named Martin also bowed and said who he was and added that he was incredibly honored to serve her. Kai turned to Martin and asked if the guest room was ready yet. The butler replied that of course they had prepared a room in the main building, so he might not worry. He said that it was a very good thing. He then extended his hand to the girl and said that he was very happy to welcome her. The girl was a little surprised that he had chosen to accompany her. She had always been treated only as a knight and never as a woman. When he saw her frightened face, he asked if she was all right. She hesitated for a while longer, but after that she put her hand in his after all, and they went to his estate. As soon as they arrived, the maid immediately took her backpack and cloak from her, and they began to walk up to her room. When he opened the door for her, Kai smiled and wished her a good rest, for she must be very tired from the road. She thanked him 100 times for that. He also smiled and told her that God would bless her in the future and wished her good night. Celia also said good night to him lastly, and afterward went into her room. The next morning she changed her clothes and went at once to his study, accompanied by a maid. As soon as Kai saw her, he immediately asked her if she had a good night's rest. She smiled and replied that of course it had been very good. She came closer and said that it was all because of him. Kai replied that he was very happy to hear that. But Celia kept talking and said that she was also incredibly grateful to him for that wonderful dress he had given her. The man replied that she shouldn't thank him so much, because he was really sorry that the only dress he had belonged to his mother and had probably gone out of fashion long ago. So next time, he would be sure to buy her something new and prettier. But the girl replied that she didn't have to do that at all, because this dress was enough for her. Then Kai asked her not to be shy, but to sit down with him. Then the maid poured tea for the girl. He looked at her with a serious look, and said that he understood she wanted to improve her magical ability in his county. He also added that it is quite strange, because to train in another estate is something unusual, and for sure unfamiliar. But Celia looked very serious and said right. Not every girl would agree to such a thing, but she wielded the fire thunder and immediately demonstrated her ability. The girl also said that as far as he knew, her family was one of the 4 counties, and they had inherited the ability in their lineage. Celia replied that none of her relatives knew how to use the gift, and she felt that the county could not train her properly, and so her talent would simply die there. Kai, after thinking about her words, said that it must have been a hard decision for her, and so she is a bastard child and a girlfriend, and also resides in a country where lineage is valued. Even if she hones her skills, her efforts may not necessarily be rewarded, so she shouldn't get her hopes up so high. Still, the girl said she wanted to at least try so she wouldn't regret it. That way at least she'd know she'd tried something. Kai was really surprised by her persistence, and he asked why, even though she knew perfectly well that it would be hard, still agreed to it. In fact, in a previous life she would not have hesitated to say that it was for Mr. Claude. He was simply the whole world to her. After all, she was happy when she loved him completely with all her heart. But she's not going to make the same mistakes in this life. So the girl replied that she was only doing it for herself, of course. She's not going to let anyone control her life. She doesn't want to make the same mistakes, so she really needs her strength. Kai, after listening to her, said that he now understood everything, and he also guaranteed her safety and full training that she would only need. However, he also said that he would not be helping her for free, and he had some conditions about it. Celia was a little wary, but she was well aware that no one was just going to keep her in their manor and give her space to practice. The man, on the other hand, said he wanted a decent result and wondered if she could produce results that would satisfy those around her. The girl looked at him carefully and said that of course she could handle it, but he also asked what she planned to do in general in the future. He would like her to tell him about her future plan of action. Celia herself wondered what she was even going to do. After all, she had no influence or status, and her only weapon was fire thunder. Then a perfect thought immediately crossed her mind. There were things that only the owners of this ability could do. So she said she wanted to be Countess of Tolis. This answer surprised the man a little, and he looked at the girl carefully, trying to see if she meant it. In fact, in the succession ceremony, in order to strengthen the power of the head, one must show his strength. But that's long gone. Now it's become a ritual to become the head of the family. Only the one with the family ability is recognized as the head of the family. That rule is still valid. And Celia, when she was a knight, never even considered becoming a chapter. But in the current situation, she needs power to survive somehow, so this was the best option for her. Looking at her, he asked if she wanted to go through the inheritance ceremony. The girl, smiling, replied that of course she did, and that it was the fastest way to achieve her goal. He started refilling their tea and said that for someone who knew how to use fire thunder, it was a really good option. He handed her the tea he'd poured, and Celia thought about how she was incredibly eager for this world to know the true value of her as a person. So the girl, with a smile on her face, said that she would definitely pay him back. The man, smiling back, said that he would look forward to it. She then decided to get down to specifics and inquired about when they would begin training. Kai, laughing, advised her to slow down a bit, since he couldn't teach her magic right now. Celia, hearing this, was very surprised and asked why that was. Had something happened to him? But he explained that she was still physically very weak, and using the force was a strain on her body. And that's why Kai can't let her ruin her own health because of her big ambitions. Celia was very surprised. She said in a trembling voice that she wanted to become stronger as soon as possible. But the man was adamant in his words and said he would not allow it. And until he gives her his permission, she is absolutely forbidden to use her magic. The girl, hearing this, was incredibly surprised. She didn't understand how it could be, and so 4 whole months had passed since then. It was already fall outside, and Celia was training with the other knights to improve her physical fitness. A girl was fighting a mannequin. She was bought a beautiful white uniform that perfectly accentuated her hair color, and she always defeated the mannequin. But then suddenly, as she finished her workout, she noticed that something started falling from the sky. It was very surprising because snow was falling from the sky and it was October. A guy named Thomas with red hair came up to her and told her that this was a perfectly common occurrence in the north. He also advised her not to worry because they don't have snow for very long, even though it can get crazy cold. Celia was disappointed when she heard this, for she disliked the cold the most. But Thomas replied that she would soon get used to it and not even notice it anymore. He drew his weapon and offered the girl another fight. Celia didn't mind that, so they went straight into battle. After a while, Thomas looked at her in surprise and asked where she had learned fencing like that. He wished she would share her secret. Well, the girl, still smiling, replied that she had been practicing a little in her house, so she already knew some basics. Immediately afterwards, she knocked the sword out of his hands in one motion so that Thomas even struck out. The guy was really surprised. It was just incredible movements that he had never seen before in his life, and he couldn't believe that the girl really called it a little training. But when the fight was over, Celia realized that she was still falling short, and concluded for herself that Kai was indeed right. In a past life, she had wielded her magic to complete perfection. But then she was already a knight with excellent physical training. For 4 months, she hadn't used magic once yet, just building up her physical strength, and it was really annoying her. Then suddenly Thomas told her to focus, and after that, he immediately swooped down on her, knocking her sword out of her hands. The girl looked at him in surprise, not understanding how he had done it at all. And then she looked at her weapon, which flew a few meters away. Thomas said she just lacked physical strength, and from the next day, he would increase her leg and back workouts. But at that moment, the maids came out to them and asked him to stop already, for Mistress Celia was having a hard time and could not stand it. But as soon as Thomas turned to the side, he saw many different baskets of food and was immediately pleased and thanked the maids for it. But one of the maids replied that it was not for him at all. She came up to Celia and, handing her food to her, said that she should take a break. The other warriors who were training were immediately excited to see the food, but the maid insisted that it was all for the mistress. And Celia at this moment remembered how when she was little, she was chased away all the time. So she smiled and suggested that they all eat together, because she would have a lot of it anyway. They all took a break and sat down on a blanket that the maids had brought in to have a little lunch. Kai, who was in his office at that moment, looked out the window and was very surprised. After that, he immediately went downstairs and went straight to them. Thomas was immediately pleased when he saw him, and he got straight to the point, inquiring how his progress was going. Guy replied that Celia was slowly growing up, and now she was keeping up with the knight's training. When Kai heard this, he was genuinely surprised and said that it was really unbelievable. After that, he looked at the fragile girl standing next to him and couldn't believe that she could really learn such a thing so quickly. After that, he asked if she would like to try using her magic already. As soon as Celia heard this, she was immediately excited and said that of course she would be happy to use it. They withdrew not far from the manor so that nothing would catch fire in case of anything, and some of the knights escorted them. Kai said he wanted to see her current abilities, so he asked that she unleash her full power. The girl, hearing this, immediately became enthusiastic and was serious. She thought of the power she had. She needed to remember feelings from her past life. She could do a lot of things during the war, all because of the emotions she felt. At that moment, she began to dig into the depths of her memory and lit a fire on her hand. Everything around her began to burn too. But then suddenly she thought of Cowley and immediately cried. Everything around her disappeared, and the girl gave in to these strong emotions. Kai, who was standing next to her, immediately became worried and asked if she was okay. But Celia answered him nothing to that. She kept crying and talking about fire magic and betrayal and many other things. But then suddenly the fire started to get even stronger and bigger. So he went over to her, grabbed her by the shoulders, and asked her to stop immediately, or it would end badly. The girl opened her eyes and immediately saw a large fire and remembered how they had started to burn her, how people had shouted that she deserved it and wished her more punishment. It made Celia feel incredibly painful. She started screaming loudly for them to stop, for she was hot and the memory was playing against her. She remembered the terrible behavior of her stepmother and sister, as well as Cole, who had betrayed her. She covered her ears and screamed loudly, and the fire spread even more. Kai tried to bring her to her senses and kept shouting her name. The fire engulfed everything around them, but the girl kept crying and screaming. The servants and some knights who were standing behind were very surprised. The fire began to spread more and more and had almost spread to the trees around them. Kai realized that he had no choice left, so he activated his abilities and started putting out that fire with ice. This sight was quite epic, for the man looked very handsome as he used his magic. He was focused on the matter at hand. A few seconds later, he and the girl were surrounded by a huge ice floe, which put out the fire. Soon after, Celia, exhausted, fell to the ground and was breathing heavily. Kai was a little worried about what had happened. Thomas immediately ran up to them and asked if they were doing well. The girl kept remembering the intense pain she felt as she was being burned alive, and she only continued to scream. She remembered the horrible words that people shouted. Kai tried to put his arm around her to calm her down, but it was no use. The girl's eyes were filled with that picture. She kept saying that she was in a lot of pain. Then the man asked her to take slow breaths in and out, and repeated all the time that everything was okay, and she was safe. He looked at the girl and realized that her magical power was too unstable, and failure to control it could even be fatal. However, he could not understand the reason for the sudden change of mood. Celia wrapped her arms around him and said that she didn't want to die anymore. She kept crying and repeating that phrase. She asked not to be burned at the stake, because she wanted to live, not suffer. And after that, she fainted. Kai immediately brought her back to the manor and laid her on the bed. Another maid sat beside her and kept a constant eye on her condition. They were all very anxious, and Celia was still lying unconscious. The maid helped her change into her home clothes. While the girl was unconscious, she recalled her past life, how her father had taken her away from her mother, saying that she would now be under his care. Just like she was given spoiled food all the time, and the maids didn't treat her like a human being at all. One of the maids even talked about serving everyone the same dishes and everyone has everything the same, and the other people probably don't see anything different about their food. Juliet always mocked her sister, and with a smile on her face asked what was wrong with her, why she said something was wrong. Rose was angry too, and spoke of Celia eating what she was given, for she had no reason to complain. Even though she is the child of a mistress, she can live in luxury. She also recalled fighting shoulder to shoulder with Kai and her lover on the battlefield. But then she remembered how she had been betrayed and eventually burned at the stake. It just depressed her, and she could even feel the pain she had felt that day. She had nightmares all night, so she was constantly screaming and crying, bleeding sweat because of the intense heat she felt in her body. But at that moment, she suddenly felt cold, and it felt very pleasant. When she opened her eyes, she saw Kai in front of her, who was using magic power to cool her down. She was immediately startled and looked at him in surprise, asking what he was doing. Kai just smiled and said that she was finally awake. He also added that he was glad, because he had been worried that she hadn't woken up for a long time. Celia gained some strength by sitting up on the bed, wondering what had even happened and how she had ended up in the bedroom. The man looked at her in surprise and wondered if she had absolutely no memory of what had happened to her. The girl replied that she only remembered snippets of it, and also said that she was insanely sorry that it had happened like that. Kai immediately interrupted her and told her that she shouldn't apologize. It was his fault for letting her use magic without careful preparation. But the girl protested and replied that it was not his fault at all. It was because she herself was not ready, and should have realized that it would end up like this, without knowing about her problem. She just provoked such a situation, and someone might even get hurt because of it. The man looked her straight in the face and said that she must know herself that magic power connects deeply with the user's mind and body. The girl didn't answer anything but continued to listen to his story. Kai said that it was very difficult to use magic without a strong body and a steady mind. He also said that he assumed it was all due to an injury she had suffered a little earlier. He wished she would tell him more about it so he could help her, because she looked just awful on the training ground then. Celia didn't know what to answer, for she wasn't sure if Kai would believe her when she told her story. But looking at how intently he was going to listen to her, she realized she shouldn't talk about it. She'd been burned at the stake and then she'd gone back in time. He certainly wouldn't believe such silly things, so she tried to make up what to tell him. Seeing how worried she was, the man replied that she didn't have to tell him everything right now. When her wound on her heart heals, she will be able to control her abilities better. So it was best for her to just move at a pace that was pleasant and comfortable for her. When he said those words, he smiled. Celia felt incredibly heavy at the thought of not being able to tell him the truth, but she thanked him for his support. The next morning, there was one incident at Second Prince Claude's estate. The man was sleeping peacefully next to the girl on the bed, when suddenly the butler came running to him. The butler was very alarmed and told him to wake up soon. Claude looked at him and sighed heavily and said that the guy was too noisy and it annoyed him. The butler handed him his shirt and told him that he was having a banquet that day, so he should hurry up as soon as possible to catch everything. Claude didn't show much enthusiasm, but he went over to get dressed. The servant, smiling, noticed that the boy was in a good mood. The prince looked at him and wondered if it was sarcasm. The butler replied that it wasn't at all, and added that it was the first time in 3 years that he had seen Claude participate in an event. He also said that he hoped he would have fun there. Claude was very indignant and said it was nonsense to say that. Looking away, he thought about the fact that Cavernan would probably come to the event as well, and smiled evilly. At this very time, Kai was already in his uniform, and watched as the knights approached the manor. He kept thinking about Celia and the incident that had happened the other day. He decided that this time he would definitely not let her die, and would do anything for her well-being.